What's going on, Cylinder Radio listeners? If you're interested in the nuance of dialogue and things like that, check out my freebie, download, Debate to Dialogue, How to Have Productive Conversations About Politics and Religion.
Hello and welcome to the next episode of Cylinder Radio. I'm your host, Will Roosh, high school teacher in Los Angeles and history teacher in Los Angeles, trying to bring viewpoint diversity to the common culture and telling stories and perspectives that aren't generally told. And my guest today, Don Alexander, writer of Shackles or Freeman, which is the story of Lewis Leary. And we're going to talk about the book, and we're going to talk about the story, and we're going to talk about lesser known figures from history. Let's just get into it, talk about history, and talk about the importance of these stories that don't get told very often. Don, it's great to have you here, man, and congratulations on the book. Let's jump into this whole thing. What's your background, first of all, and then what prompted you to write the book specifically about Lewis Leary and his story?
Well, so a little bit about myself. I was born in a military base, Fort Huachuca, Arizona.
Okay.
My dad was a 30-year Army veteran. Needless to say, he joined a year before I was born.
Your whole life?
My whole life.
Yeah.
So, I moved around. I spent my elementary school days in Germany. When moving around after my parents got divorced, I lived with my mom. We went to this military base called Camp Pendleton over in California by San Diego County. Then I decided after my mom decided to move to Wisconsin, I went to 6 different middle schools, by the way. It was crazy. But needless to say, there's a lot of things going on. I ended up living with my dad when I was 14 to Heidelberg, Germany. Ended up graduating high school there. So thankfully, I was able to go to one high school after moving around so much. I think that's where I kind of garnered or gathered some world perspective. And I always, in understanding the way the world was, especially being in Germany, you have to actually know history because you're living in it.
Right.
And I just remember always being kind of hyper aware of what was going on around. I mean, at 5 years old, my dad, it was during the Gulf War. I'm aging myself, but I was 5 years old during the Gulf War in 1990. And I remember my dad kind of kneeling down to me and saying, hey, this is what my job is, and I might have to go to war, and this is what war is. But then also, you have to kind of learn why you're in Germany because of too.
Yeah.
So I was always fascinated with history, but also we used to have a lot of Buffalo Soldier paintings, and especially being in Arizona, also a lot of Native American paintings and all that. So I was always kind of curious about that.
Yeah.
So that's what kind of built my interest in history. I had to understand as a kid, okay, and my mom is Puerto Rican.
Okay.
So I was in a mixed up world.
Your dad's black.
My dad's black. My mom is Puerto Rican. I'm living in Germany, going on a military base, right? We go to American school. You're learning all this stuff where, okay, well, you're an American, you're in Germany. Well, why am I in Germany? Well, because this war happened, and this is where I'm stationed. So it was a very quick grasp on, okay, this world, this life that I'm living, there's a lot to it.
Yeah, it's really interesting. There's a great Mark Twain quote, and I'm going to butcher it, but something along the lines of like, nothing's more poisonous to bigotry and short-sightedness than like traveling the world, or something along those lines. Yeah, do you feel like that? Like, as much as that was six middle schools in that like little span, but like, it must have given you a perspective on the complexity of human beings and the way we categorize ourselves, like, as opposed to just staying in one spot and understanding even things like race. Like, it's more complex when you're around all these different people from all these different places.
For sure.
Yeah.
The one thing, though, that was taught to us when we were kids in military base is that it was the commonality. You kind of lean to the common goal type of deal, where I went to a very diverse school. It's funny, when I went to college, they were like, oh, well, you're from Germany. And it's funny because my school is very diverse. You're talking white, black, Asian, Hispanic, everything that encompasses American society was in my school, in any base that I've ever been on. So you start there. Okay, well, American, okay, then you start breaking it down. But then you realize we're more common than we are separate. And I guess that's when some of the culture shock came in. I, decided to back to the States. And then I realized how much everything is. So we lived out in the economy in Germany. So you can live out in the base, and live out in the economy. That's when you live out in a German town. So you'll have German neighbors. You're catching the school bus in a German neighborhood.
Here.
And then also where I went to school in Heidelberg, there was a heavy Turkish population, Russian population, African, all that. So it was very diverse even in that. So it was a melting pot there. And the funny thing about it was that you learned real quick, and this is different.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then you go, okay, but where do I fit in? And I feel myself always asking that. But I think that's what a lot of people ask themselves.
Yeah.
Where do I, no matter what your background is, we all go through that, because within a group, all individuals. So you can be within a group of, you talk about jujitsu, or you be in a group of all jujitsu fighters, but then at the same time, you have to ask yourself, well, where do I fit in all this?
Yeah.
And so I felt that a lot.
That's an interesting thing. I actually just got back from the gym, like in the jiu-jitsu room, in the military, those immutable characteristics kind of melt away when you have a common goal. You don't really care. Like, I have a lot of friends in the military, and like, they don't really care about what skin color you have or religion. It's like, are you going to have my back in battle? Are you going to be a good training partner? The wrestling room, like, you don't care. If it's a little Asian kid, it doesn't matter. Can he get me good, rounds and stuff like that? I think that one of the problems when we get so divided on those kinds of characteristics is when you can't find, what do we have in common? And there's so much in our culture right now that's trying to break us up apart from each other. We're like showing how you and I are so different, as opposed to what do we have in common? And we just met each other 5 minutes ago. Right away, we're like talking about wrestling, grappling, jiu-jitsu. It's like, boom. I think if we can do that as much as a society as possible, that's how we bridge a lot of the gaps. And of course we have differences, but where do we align, I think, is a really important thing for us.
Well, for sure. And that gets into the book.
Yeah.
Where in the book, they talk about Harpers Ferry. And a lot of things, there had to have been a commonality to fight against something, or to have an agreement to be involved in such an event like this.
Can you just break down Harpers Ferry? Because I teach it. It's in the California State Standards for U.S. history. Like, it has to be taught. Can you just break us down? Because a lot of people don't know history class. So, like, what was that?
Because I got my first introduction with Harpers Ferry. I remember watching Roots when I was about 10.
Okay.
And I'll tell you what, so for me, in moving around a lot, the only thing that was consistent in my life were movies and music.
Yeah.
So I was, my favorite movie at 6 years old was Glory. I saw Glory for the first time.
That's a great movie, yeah.
And then also Tombstone. My mom was like, hey, you were born in Orchard, Arizona. That's down the road from Tombstone.
Oh, awesome.
I fell in love with these movies, Forrest Gump, all that, Braveheart. I was just into history. So that being said, with Harpers Ferry, I remember my first introduction was watching the series Roots. I remember them, seeing the John Brown and all that. And it was kind of like, okay, cool, because we learned about that in school as well, the precursor to a big event called the Civil War.
Yeah.
Before that was in studying, then before that was also a lot of things boiling up into that point.
Bleeding Kansas and stuff like that. Like, for sure. It's like, the way I explain it to my class is like, it's just riot. Like, there are just these riots, like these little pockets in specific areas of the country. And that was like the precursor to the Civil War, just like the Boston Tea Party.
For sure. For sure. How I came about to Lewis Leary, right?
Yeah. Like, why this story? Why did this story capture you?
So I'm a screenwriter by trade. I'm out here and everything like that. And we're in the middle of trying to raise money and development for another story called Bare Knuckle Buffalo. It's about a buffalo soldier. So not to get into full detail, when I was researching, I was going to have one of the characters' brother be involved in Harpers Ferry. I like to do anything that I do, I like to dive right into the research, just because everywhere I'm at, I like to just kind of look at the history and feel it a little bit. I'm sitting there doing research, and then the pictures come up. That's the beauty about going online and kind of looking. I've always, as a kid, I used to love looking at old pictures, black and white photos, where you're looking at someone that might have been 19, 20, 30. At that one point, they have lived, but you're literally looking at a ghost, because if you're looking at a picture from the 1800s, no matter how old that person is, they're no longer around right now. I always found I can look through a yearbook from 1898 from a college. I did that once. I was in college, and I'm looking at a yearbook. I'm like, look at all these people smiling. This big, thick yearbook, nobody's around. Always found the beauty of that. So I see a picture of this guy named Lewis Leary, and I saw some commonalities. It was kind of weird. I was almost looking at a photo that, let's say you see a photo of yourself as a kid, and you're like, oh, I've never seen this photo before, but I see something. I was like, wow, kind of looks like me, right? Kind of threw it away. I did some more research on Harpers Ferry just to pull the scene out. But then I went on Wikipedia and looked up this person even further. Lewis Leary, actually, he was born March 17th, 1835. So March 17th, 1835, which is St. Patrick's Day.
Yeah.
Well, I was born March 17th, 1985. That's
150
years. So I dropped my phone. I'm like, that's kind of weird.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know, just kind of always understanding Harpers Ferry as just this event that just went wrong. That's the way we learn it. That's the way we taught. Oh, John Brown got these guys together and they went out and they had this raid at Harpers Ferry and they went completely awry. And there you go. That's how it was packaged to me.
Yeah, the idea for people that don't know the story is essentially the guy John Brown was an abolitionist, he was a white guy, but his goal with his sons was to rob an armory, like a military base, basically take a bunch of guns and then distribute them to slaves to upthrow like slavery. I mean, it sounds like a Quentin Tarantino movie. It's a really dope concept. The kind that like, let's arm the slaves to kill their slave masters and like start that kind of.
Well, he was actually very smart in that. So I think the way we package it up is it's simplistic, right? Let's get the weapon and bring him to slaves.
Yeah.
Right. But ultimately doing that would cause more pressure because each state laws, even writing this book, I had to look up different state laws for slave. And it's like each state is almost like Europe. Each state has their own set of laws.
We have a federalist system. It's supposed to be that way. Now kind of every state is like, I mean, we're getting to see it now a little bit more separation, but that's the way.
But back in those days, being a free black man in North Carolina, than being a free black man in South Carolina or in Florida.
Yeah.
They had their own separate freeman laws or their own separate slave laws and different things like that. So John Brown knew that, okay, if we can go here, get the arms and move, word's going to spread. And maybe that puts pressure on Washington to go, okay, well, we need to act real fast.
Yeah.
So we'll put pressure on the southern states because they don't want that to happen. And then, of course, the northern states have been fighting to eradicate slavery because all the Western world was already done with it. By early 1800s, Europe was starting to do away with slavery.
Yeah.
Pressure on the United States was, hey, you need to solve this problem now because the rest of the world is too.
So that's what you're saying about common ground. So John Brown and his sons, right? He had a bunch of sons doing it too. So he was a white guy, but like we were saying, common cause is like it was him, and then there was a whole bunch of people across, black and white and whatnot. Like, hey, let's all do this because we all believe in the repugnant kind of concept of.
It was a diverse
slavery of the Atlantic.
100%. And also, he treated everyone equally.
Yeah.
If you watch a lot of stuff on John Brown, they have him being super eccentric and, just
tough, right? Like a real
tough. But at times I think it dips off because if you look at how news spread it back then, we always call the term propaganda. The South, knowing John Brown from Bleeding Kansas and all that, they had always said this guy is crazy and he's nuts.
Of course.
I think sometimes that we take that narrative that they back then that was only designed for Southern propaganda and we trickle it up. So our image of John Brown is this crazy eccentric guy that got everybody together.
And the picture where he looks like an intense dude.
Oh, yeah. Very intense. But there's a lot of guys that had beards and looked kind of crazy back then.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I think we mixed that craziness with, I want to say he was more passionate because here's a person that actually put his money where his mouth was. And that was really hard to find back then.
Oh, what a sacrifice. I mean, he ended up he was hung.
Oh, yes.
His sons were killed. That's.
He only had one son that survived there. One son out of other three that was there that actually died at Harpers Ferry.
Yeah, so what a sacrifice, right? I mean, we look at that throughout the civil rights movement and everything like that. Like, it's something I bring up to my students because they'll like stage like a walkout for a cause, for gun violence or something like that. And I'll say like, are you serious about this issue? Like, yeah. I was like, all right, here's what we're going to sacrifice. We're going to stay here after school. We're going to write legislation. We're going to do this. We're going to get on the phone. We're going to email. And they're like, ugh, how much are you willing to sacrifice for your cause? Because if you're willing to miss algebra class, then you don't really care that much. We look at the people that we truly admire throughout history. They sacrificed a lot. Gandhi, starved himself. Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. Like, these are people who knew they were going to be killed. They were killed.
They put their money where their mouth.
Yeah.
And you mentioned something. Watching Dr. Martin Luther King last speech is always, I would tell anybody that's watching this, watch that because that was the man that knew, just like you said, that I am really going to be sacrificing something. That's with conviction. With that, I think of John Brown in the same kind of token where in this world, because we learn about the civil rights movement in the 1860s, but very seldom do we learn about the civil rights movement in the 1850s. And now that right there takes on its own kind of, when you really like the Oberlin College in Ohio, how big they were. And then Detroit, the faction that they had there at Detroit, the, abolitionist movement, I think sometimes we limit when we talk about history, to package it up and I understand how it's packaged up and disseminated, right?
Yeah.
But the Underground Railroad was a network of systems that were going on before Harriet Tubman and while, not to devalue, because Harriet Tubman played a very integral part in that process of the Underground Railroad. But the Underground Railroad also trickled into it was a whole network.
Yeah.
It was a web.
Yeah.
So it went from, all over the place, up to Detroit, to Canada, up through New York. When we learn about the Underground Railroad, we always think of Harriet Tubman. Like I said, it's one of those things where this book, Underground Railroad, was a lot of guys were taking slaves and trying to trickle them up to Canada.
Yeah. It took a groundswell, like the people just think like the Civil War happened, it was Fort Sumter or something like that, like started it or whatever. But like that takes some time. It took individuals to try to push back and push back. It started with like, riots and street fights and stuff like that. Like that's how this stuff kind of happens. But you chose to focus on Lewis Leary and tell this story because he's not known. I didn't know who he was.
No, for sure.
No, I didn't know who Harriet Tubman. Yeah, I know John Brown.
Well, also in mentioning like Harriet Tubman, but I think there's a story about Shields Green who's actually featured in this book. But just like you have your movies like Django Unchained.
Yeah,
mentioned Tarantino. I love that. Sometimes we look at where if you see stories like this, sometimes we focus on the person that was involved in it, like let's say was a slave, right? The story of a slave that has lived to be a slave, runs away, and then goes back and helps or fights for his freedom because he knows what it's like.
Yeah. Frederick Douglass had an element.
There you go. Frederick Douglass ran away, got his freedom, and then, became an abolitionist and became such a great orator, speaker. Lewis Leary, he was born free in North Carolina. His father had a trade. He was a harness and saddle maker. He was he came from a free, wealthy black family. Now that's what really got me in depth. Lewis Leary, because exactly. Forget about free black population that we had in America during that time in the North and also in the South. Like I said, it was different freeman laws. Where in North Carolina, there was a high population of free blacks. And also if you had a trade like a brick mason, saddle harness business, all that, you were respected in the community, which is really, you don't really see that. I looked up the census, you're just seeing a bunch of stuff where it's like, wait a second, I never heard this before.
Maybe you can help me with this. This is something that I'm ignorant about, even as a history teacher, is like, what was the dynamic like? If you were a wealthy, free black man, you were in a slave state. What was that dynamic like? Was it like, did you see them as like your brother? Did you see them as something different from you? Like, how was that dynamic?
Looking at history, I always kind of try to, even as a writer, right? You try to put yourself in someone else's shoes and then try to understand what the system is, where there were some that said, oh man, that's our brethren, or maybe some free blacks got their freedom from a former slave, so they knew what it was like. But then there were some free blacks that were born into it. So
some had slaves. I mean, it's crazy. Yeah.
So a lot of them looked at it where it was a system. I'm a free black man. 9 times out of 10 back then in the South, especially if they were wealthy, if they were making a living for themselves, sometimes they turned the other cheek and they said, okay, well, that's the system. That is not me, which, it's not. History is not pretty. I always try to tell them, we all have mud on our face. You had some free blacks that owned slaves, right? Not to devalue the harshness of slavery and whatnot, but you had whites that owned slaves. But just like you've had whites that fought against slavery and blacks that fought against slavery. Our history is not pretty, but I honestly think when you look at it and you go, wow, all these things had to happen for us to be alive today.
Yeah.
I try to do right by those souls that have suffered. I mean, the world, the earth in general has had its history. And think about like when I lived in Germany, you still had people that were alive during
like Nazism.
Exactly. And so you ask yourself, oh my God, this is where this happened? This place? You go, wow, that was just around the corner.
Yeah.
And you realize, okay, well, where do we all lie in this ball that's rolling? And it's always dynamic.
Yeah. Don, you know what I think about a lot is like, where would I be if I was in that situation? You know what I mean? Like, because we all think like, if I was in the South in the 1850s, I would have been an abolitionist and I would have stood up and said, you let that slave go. It's like, probably not. I would hope so. If I was in Germany and everyone was given the Nazi salute, I would hope that I'd be the one in that photograph who said no. Probably not. Would I hide it and break my attic? Probably not.
There's that interesting study, a psychology study, where they're paying these students to. They said, okay, well, we're going to have this person answer questions, and we want you to shock them.
Yeah. Milgram experiment. Yep.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Tell them what to do, and a lot, okay, all right, a lot of them good people.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because it's the moral fabric. Are you going to be the person that stands with the crowd, or are you going to be that person that's an outlier?
Yeah.
And that stands outside the crowd? And a lot of it's fear-based, right? A lot of people are afraid to stand up or say anything. So that's the reason why with Lewis Leary, I felt such a dynamic, here's a free black man who's wealthy, who chooses. He doesn't like the situation. And the book goes into it, the reason why he kind of has a moral, this is not right. These are our people.
But he could have turned a blind eye. He could have just definitely could have. Doesn't affect me. That's on them. It's a system. The system, they're like, people talk about the system now. The system, like, what can I do? It's the entire American system. Nothing that I as an individual can do. Yeah.
Lewis Leary could have ignored it, gone on with it. He was an excellent harness and saddle maker. Cool. I'm free. Whenever, it's not my problem. He made it his problem.
Wow.
A free black man in the South, wealthy, made it his problem. So he didn't like what was going on with that. He as he saw was the hypocrisy of it. So he ended up moving to a free state, Ohio, and in a place called Oberlin, which in history, I mean, they should give a lot more credit than they've gotten. Oh my God, that was the kind of the mecca of anti-slavery movement. And it was a very diverse neighborhood, like a town, whites and blacks, and it was really tightly knit. There was a lot of people from North Carolina that moved over to Ohio and made that their home. Well, now, if you're there, you don't really see it a lot, right?
Yeah.
Some people made it their mission to go across the border to Kentucky to free slaves and join the Underground Railroad. And that's another choice. So I wanted to focus on this character who made that choice. Like I said, other characters have made that choice, but it's different when you have suffered through something.
Mm-hmm.
Makes you really want to.
Yeah.
But how about that person that did it?
Yeah. So what was that? What is that get them to, lack of a better term, sorry, but give a shit? Because it's so easy not to. So what is it that you go, I'm going to do the risky thing. I'm going to give up the comfort. I'm going to do this thing that I don't have to do. What was that catalyst?
I wanted to. So in every movie and every story, and then when you look at history and look at these individuals, I always say it's very nuanced. A lot of times it's not just cut and dry. And one thing I learned in studying history is the cause and effect, right? Go, okay, what was the cause and what was the effect? And then the individuals involved in it, right? So when you look at someone like Lewis Leary, what was it? Well, in the book, I wanted to highlight what got him. The reason why it's called Shackles of a Free Man is because we sometimes have a lot of ideas in our head, and sometimes those ideas become way more powerful than we would ever imagine, and that becomes our burden. Whatever idea that he had, it manifested in him to making the decision to take that trip to Harpers Ferry.
Do you think it was like you're familiar with like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey and stuff like that? Like just the idea of like, that's like your life's goal is like, maybe he was almost complacent because he's wealthy, he's comfortable and stuff like that. And he's like, I need like a staple for my life. People think about legacy a lot.
Oh yeah.
Where's your legacy?
So, I mean,
is it maybe something like that? I don't know.
No, so the book will go into, the story goes in and dives deep into why someone like that would make those decisions. But even if you look at it, I mean, this is Lewis Leary, a free black man from North Carolina who makes this decision to go and join the anti-slavery movement and fight against institution of slavery. Yeah. We shouldn't devalue also the abolitionists, like just because it was a diverse group.
Yeah.
It was people, money had to make that happen. I think a lot of times if you look at, like I said, ideas, it could be religious, it could be anything, a burden, a sense of duty, a sense of morale, all these things that we all deal with, I think, on an individual level. We have to, but sometimes it's more extreme or the other. I think at the end of the day, I do, and that's great that you said that. I basically wrote this for any reader to kind of get their perspective and maybe look into the mirror and ask themselves, where do I stand? Or where do I stand in all of this? Or where does my values or my morale lie? And it's this, and it's because like I said, it's all nuance. There are some historical nuggets in here where it's like, wow, I didn't know that. Because I do dive in deep into my whole thing when I'm writing anything is to be very authentic and try to take the reader into the environment and not make it so cookie cutter. I was like, okay, well, here I am in the 1850s. I'm expecting this. There's people that had to live through.
Yeah. Complex characters are always interesting.
Oh, for sure.
And one of the things that's really cool about this, I've heard this before, that every person suffers 3 deaths. First is like your death, die. And then second one is the last person that's ever known you dies. And then third one, the last death is when the last time someone ever utters your name.
Wow. Yeah.
So it's an interesting concept. So like you can be essentially in some way like immortal if people continue to talk about your, Abraham Lincoln or someone like that. And what you're doing here is you're bringing this name back for someone who made a very bold choice that morality was always the right thing. But back then it was like,
well, they were seen as terrorists.
Yeah, they were terrorists. That's exactly right.
Terrorists. They were seen as insurgents, terrorists, and all every bad name, treason, all that.
As were our founding fathers. So like, time vindicates, but you're bringing his name back where it could have been forgotten. It could have stayed in that library where you first saw it.
It's funny that you mention it because I just got into Coco, the Disney movie. I hadn't seen it, and when it first came out, watched it about a couple months ago. I'm like, wow, where's this movie been?
Yeah, that's cool.
So 100%, I feel that same way with Lewis Leary because his family. I mean, it's interesting, and I'll throw this nugget out here as well. Is Langston Hughes from the Harlem Renaissance. If things didn't transpire in Lewis's life, there would be no Langston Hughes. Lewis's wife, without giving anything up. Well, Lewis's wife, widowed, she ends up marrying Charles Langston, and they have a daughter, and the daughter is the mother of Langston Hughes.
Whoa!
And so, instead of that, knowing that, you really feel the impact of Lewis because Mary Sampson Patterson, Lewis's widow, she wrote and always talked about Lewis, husband who, was a hero. So but then how far did that go? I think Lewis's name was mentioned in probably Langston Hughes' poetry, probably a couple times, maybe once, but in his writings for sure. But then what happens after that? Then these guys all fade away.
Right.
2020 happened to everybody, right? I always told myself I was going to write a book at 35, and it kind of gave me an excuse with the lockdowns and everything.
Yes.
I'm a screenwriter by trade.
Okay.
And we didn't know what the movie industry was going to do anything. So it was like, I might as well just sit down, really go in and write this. To tag on to that, I really started to not learn, but maybe relearn or validate some things. So I lost my dad October of 2021. I remember when I wrote the first draft, I was always sending him like different chapters and we would kind of walk through the story and everything like that. And unfortunately, he's not here to see this. But at the same time, after his death, I thought about that same thing. He's spent 30 years in the Army, military intelligence, different theaters. His last deployment was in Iraq. And then, was diagnosed with cancer shortly after that. My dad was such a fixture in my life that, you learn how to be proud or the self-empowerment or make choices and things that, these ideas that look at the world and go, okay, well, going back to where do I fit in?
Yeah.
And an individual has to look in the mirror and go, where do I fit in? And try to pick your spots and trying to find that. I think that Lewis, as a person in history, I don't think someone like that should ever be forgotten. I think to myself, my dad who served this country for 30 years, though we may say people like that are heroes, he's not going to be in the history book.
Right.
Spoiler alert.
Right.
And I think about that. And how I go, Lewis Leary, someone like him, he plays a part in that, just like the 50 Massachusetts England. Mm-hmm. I was always interested in Black American military history because I go, wow, you're making a choice to fight for this country
Ah,
when given all the things that are against you,
yeah.
that takes a special person.
And all the ugliness, about this country, it's still like fighting for it because you believe, it has to be because you believe in the ideal of what America could be. Like America is always, the way I kind of present it is like, I'm hypercritical of it, but like my Jeep has like a big American flag on it. Like I love this country. That's why I'm critical of it.
Yeah,
you know?
this as well.
Yeah, but I like the idea that I think you believe in the potential, like what it could be. We haven't lived up to it yet, but we have our eyes aimed on it. We want to fight for what it could be.
So that's the reason why I wanted to bring this story up. Like I said, these guys were considered terrorists,
Yeah.
presidents, and all that. But if you actually look at that group with John Brown, you had whites and blacks all fighting, right? The idea of freeing this country of that sin, that was the most American.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you really
Absolutely. 100%.
of it.
Yeah.
Idea. We always get caught up in the hit, but if you look at the idea, people used to come over here with streets. Remember the idea of streets paved with gold? I always think of the American Tale. There are no kids in America.
Well, my wife's from the Philippines. She's like, I thought everyone was wearing white. She's like, I thought the streets would be white. She just thought it had this like picture, like what a kid would think of like heaven.
But think about that idea, though.
Yeah.
How powerful that idea is to someone outside of it, right? And so I look at it and I go, okay, well, like I said, I'm critical of it as well. I try to look at the nuance of, okay, where have we improved and where do we have to be?
Yeah.
But then when you look at history and you look, and these people actually lived and breathed. There are people that have suffered. There are people that and are still suffering generations.
Yeah.
I honestly think, I always say change happens inside out. There has to be a sense of empowerment and there's this thing called dignity that a lot of people had to garner just to get through the day.
Yeah.
Just to get through society. I'm almost in fear that we're kind of losing that in a sense.
Yeah.
Not to be like, you said you're a high school teacher, and I used to coach wrestling high school students. Would you realize how easy it is for one of those kids to be discouraged? All it takes, maybe you saying something, maybe they lose a match, maybe someone gets a bad grade, and it all depends on what you say to that person and to that kid. If it weighs, a lot of times teachers, coaches, sometimes we have a bigger influence than the parents. My parent says this all the time. But then a teacher or a coach saying something may hold more weight. So I always say, that's the difference. But then to make that kid confident, the confidence takes one.
It doesn't take much. I've heard Jordan Peterson say, he's like, it takes so little. It's like, it's really sad that it takes so little, and yet so many people are starving for it and don't get it.
Well, realize how many people ask, hey, what's wrong? Instead of saying, hey, what's right?
Yeah. Yeah. How are you? Like, they don't really care.
Yeah, no, exactly. And, I'm always fascinated because how, if you really look at history through a genuine lens, and then you face like, man, it was like mud, blood, sweat, everything.
Yeah.
I look at stuff like this, the individuals that were involved in Harpers Ferry, they had no idea what that would boil into. And this country had to go through a crazy war in the 18th.
Yeah.
And then that still wasn't enough. You still had to go through Reconstruction, and assassination of Lincoln really, changed a lot of things that were, could have been better for the country.
Yeah, I mean, that's where I get really frustrated with the idea that like we haven't done anything, we haven't made improvements or something like that. Like, yes, we had a real dark racist past, absolutely, but the war that were fought to try and right that wrong. I mean, like Antietam, the numbers of people who died, for black and white, a lot of white people. I mean, like that's where it gets so complex. Is like you can't just say that we were just a racist country. It's yes and.
Yeah, exactly. It's
Just like people,
no, for sure. I look at it like the whole world, right? Living in Germany going, man, there was a whole World War II started here. But then if you talk to a German and you say, hey, you guys caused World War II.
Yeah.
And the person's like 21, 30. They go, what? No, we atoned for it, but I have to move forward from it. Yeah, so we get nowhere. And from in Germany, and they built that thing up. I just remember moving This Würzburg is like in the 90s. And I remember my mom had mentioned, man, they bombed this place. This place was nothing. And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, wow, this place is nothing. And I got kind of scared because like, when did this happen? I almost felt like it happened like 2 years, years old. So I'm thinking it could happen anytime. But as I don't know, it was the 1940s. And then you get your concept of time. I think that there's been a lot of improvement. And I think sometimes when we're critical of it, we should also have the same energy to the improvement where we kind of focus on the negative.
Yeah.
I think the acknowledgement of the idea of what this is. And there's people that come from all over the world to be here. And it has a lot to do with the idea. And for anything, the ideas in movies, and you have ideas in religion, even cults have ideas.
Yeah.
And it's all about how the individual feels about that. And then that's when you come up with your passion and your conviction. But then at the same time, you have to kind of look in the mirror and go, okay, where do I fit in and all that?
Yeah. And that's the concept of my podcast is like, it's yes. And we have come very far in this country and we have a ways to go. And why can't we can just hold those, but we like the simple of it's one or the other, but that's just not accurate.
Yeah, I always look at it like this, and it's always perspective, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you can talk to someone, let's say, talk to two brothers that their parents were poor, they grew up poor. Two brothers, one is successful, and the other one is perceived to just not be successful.
Right.
And let's say you ask that one brother that was successful, "Hey, man, how come you made it?" And you go, "Oh man, I was poor. I had to do this, I had to do that." And the list goes on. And then if you ask the poor brother, quote unquote, unsuccessful brother, "Hey, how come you're unsuccessful?" He might give you the same list his other brother did. The same list.
Pressure breaks pipes or makes diamonds.
and that's for sure. And it's all about perspective. There are people that have been able to succeed from the hardship, but then there's also people that have faltered.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things. We talk about confidence, self-empowerment. Sometimes a parent can be the worst thing for a kid to hear. You can't do that. You can't do that. A lot of times that comes from another generation telling you.
Yeah.
But then what happens? The person ends up doing it, and they might be a pioneer in something.
For sure.
I think everybody holds the power to having that idea of what they want to be, what that looks like to them.
Yeah. And what's going to serve you? Like, what's the approach that's going to serve you? I mean, if you can focus on the ways that you're a victim, because we all are, and some definitely more than others. There are objective, horrible atrocities that happen to individuals, but how can you play your 7-2 offsuit? Like in a poker metaphor, you got to play it best you can, and the best way to play it, that's the way to do it. I mean, I don't know what other advice to give, especially to young people.
Yeah.
Well, play your hand best you can. I know it's unfair. This is unfair. I know, but what's going to be best for you is you can sit here and say, this is an unfair hand, or you can play it. I don't know what else to do. I get it.
It's when I empathize. Well, for sure. I used to speak to a group of 8th graders. They used to have me speak to them when I was on base, when I worked for the Army. I was a civilian for the Army, worked as a marketing specialist. And they had known that I was a coach, and I had played semi-pro over in Germany. So I was doing a lot of things. And they were like, "Hey, we want you to talk to these 8th graders that are going in." And one of the things that I tell them, I was like, when you go into high school, you don't really realize this. Those 4 years are the most that you're ever going to change physically, mentally, and maybe spiritually, right? It's all the discovery that comes along with it. You're 8th grade. You're like, 4 years, that seems like forever to us now as old guys.
Yeah, yeah.
It's like that.
I know.
But to the 8th graders, I'm about to enter into, guess what? That high school is their world, their planet, their country. Right? Think about when they go in, they come out completely different. And it all takes, who was confident, who was not, who had more struggles. A lot of times you'll see that just growing up in general, it hurts.
Yeah. Yeah, I know.
This thing we call life, but I honestly think that once you can believe, I hate to sound cookie cutter like Disney, but it's not just believing that you can achieve anything, also is putting the work in, comes with that idea. I might have the idea that I can get there, it's putting in the work, but you do have, a lot of times having a support system helps as well.
Yeah, but that's what I think is also lacking today is it's a lot of armchair activism. It's a lot of social media activism. I put a little black box on my Instagram, so I did my work. My work is done here. It's it's going to take more than that. I mean, going back to the story is like you said, putting your money where your mouth is.
Yeah, John Brown angered a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because back in those days, there was a lot of orators, just like now, I have a lot of people that are inspirational speakers, motivational speakers. The list goes on. If you saw that number maybe 25 years ago, that list was probably small. Now it's everybody,
everybody.
It's a saturated market. So back then, there was a lot of speakers, orators, talking about, anti-slavery and all that. There was a lot of times where people were like, okay, well then what do we do now? And it's that thing where, like you said, pressure busts pipes, and it's like, okay, when John Brown had literally fought a campaign, I believe in Kansas, where they are fighting a war in this mixed up state of Kansas, that whether it's going to be a free state. Yeah. And there's another thing.
They put it up for the vote.
That they had people come across the border to vote for their side. And the border Assamese, the free staters, versus the border referendum. Yeah. So John Brown angered a lot of people because he was like, okay, when are we going to do this? When are we going to do this? Because it only is this way. And everybody's like, hold on now, John Brown. But he got people together, and it was the idea of, look, we are going to just stir up the pot, and we are going to make sure that this country rids of its, as John Brown saw as its original sin of slavery. So,
yeah. Let me ask you something. You're a screenwriter. We're in LA, Hollywood. Like, a story like this checks a lot of boxes for an awesome film, but I just saw a preview this morning. They're remaking White Man Can't Jump. Another Spider-Batman movie, what seems to happen, other Ghostbusters, whatever it is, movies are so expensive that it seems like you don't want to take a risk. So let's just go with what we know will hit. So this has worked before, we're going to work again. If we just throw a superhero suit on someone, not to dump on the Marvel movies and stuff like that, but I just don't like the lack of risk taking where a story like this checks the boxes. Is it hard to get something like this picked up? Because it's not a sure thing?
I'm not really shopping this around now.
Yeah. But just the idea of something like this.
Well, yeah. So yes. And
okay. Yeah.
I think we are actually in so if we think about it in the confines of time, I think about this. If you go 100 years ago, if we look at from the 1980s to now, how fast technology is going. Movies in the confines of human history is a new medium, completely new medium. In the course of 100 years, how fast that's changed. Video game, music.
Yeah.
And so people are afraid to take risk on newer things, newer ideas, because the heyday, I want to say the peak of just innovation with some movies and media in general, because that everything is merged together, is I would say the 90s. Now think about 90s was when you had the big super blockbusters, right?
Yeah.
Breaking records, and you had revolutionary movies, Jurassic Park, your Forrest Gump, right? Saving Private Ryan, what it's done. Then The Matrix in the 2000s, these were blockbusters that kind of revolutionized the game. There's only so much that we could do. Now you have to think to yourself, did we peak? Is there still music? Because they remake a lot of things.
Yeah.
Music, they remix a lot of things. I think right now they're just focused on nostalgia buck, where people our age have kids, and if you reboot, if you reboot Ninja Turtles for the 10th time,
they are. I just was at the moment.
What I was a kid, and I'm gonna take my kid, or I'm gonna watch it, Spider-Man or whatnot. It's the regurgitation. I'm actually hopeful. There was a time where I was kind of bummed out, because I think there's so many stories to be told.
I guess that's what I'm getting at. There's so many untold stories, and we're doing the same story again of Peter Parker, his uncle dying. There is a hunger for it, but there is that nostalgia thing. So it's true.
Well, because they know people will sit down and watch.
Yeah.
I do think, though, people are going to be hungry for more and more original stories.
Yeah.
That's where I'm hopeful. Because I do a lot of genres, but I love war history or high complex war history. So, my one screenplay we have, Bare Knuckle Buffalo, that's another original film original screenplay about a buffalo soldier.
He's a boxer?
Yeah, about the title. I don't want to give too much.
Yeah.
He grew up fighting.
Yeah.
Where it's you have to kind of choose to fight for something.
Yeah, I mean, I love Creed. I watched with my kids. I watched the third Creed movie, which is the 9th Rocky movie. But there isn't a single Jack Johnson movie. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. Oh, That's funny. But I just thought about that.
Ultimate, you would have if you had like some like Duesenberg or something like that, and you get a speeding ticket going into town, he'd pay double because he's like, I'm gonna be speeding rather than
I might as well just pay.
I love it.
The guy had so much dignity and pride.
Yeah.
And he walked around and he knew.
How is that not a movie? You know what I mean? Like there's like that's what I guess I'm getting at is like there's these stories that are so good and they could be done with the technology we have now and the way that we can do CGI and everything like that. We can do it so well.
But I'm very hopeful about
Yeah.
We are going to have those.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's going to be a whole bunch of movies like that going forward. I honestly think because movies are still a new medium, but guess what's not a new? Storytelling.
Yeah. Yeah.
No matter how long, even,
It's old as humanity, yeah.
always be storytelling. This can only go so long. Like you said, I'm a huge Spider-Man fan, but
Yeah.
even I get tired of rebooting Spider-Man. Well, it's funny because Spider-Man, when I was a kid, he was like 28 or 30 going through life.
Yeah.
And every time now as I get older, Spider-Man gets younger. So,
She's like 6th grade now.
well, now there's like 600 of them now.
I guess to kind of encapsulate this stuff, John Haidt, who's a social scientist that I really love and influenced like my thinking a lot, he said the human brain is a story processor, not a logic processor. The way to kind of understand life is through story. Through this story, the breakdown that you have in the book, what would you say are the biggest like lessons that we kind of could take from that for us in 2023, for young people, old people, for humanity, for our country? What are the big lessons to extract from the Lewis Leary story that we should apply to help us guide us through kind of our crazy time in 2023?
Oh, for sure. Great question. I think a story like this with Lewis Leary, who made the choice to kind of stand up for something, the choice, but also live it. I know it's old school to say, put your money where your mouth is, conviction, live it, breathe it. That's where you kind of get where your passion lies. It doesn't go with following the crowd a lot. I think that's a lot of times that we're having now.
Right.
But there's a group for here. And I want to, like, even if you're a part of a group, part of a faction, kind of step outside that, look in the mirror and ask yourself where you fit in within that. And where does your pride and dignity lie? Where's your conviction? Where's your passion? Because when you look at history, when you see these individuals, they didn't have computers, right? They didn't have what we have. I mean, we have a treasure trove of just knowledge on our phone.
Yeah.
We can have an argument. It's like, wait a second, let me look it up. Back in the day, you actually had to solve the argument there and then look it up later. And hopefully you're right? But now it's like, we'll solve this. Let me Google it.
It's hard to be us, yeah.
Back in those days, those guys, or, women as well, like just everybody who were a part of something, they had to sleep with what they had this, like dreaming, sometimes losing sleep. And a lot of times you'll see in this book, there was a lot of times that Lewis lost sleep. Because sometimes, that's how much it affects you. So I would say for any individual, you got to find those, hopefully, we all have shackles in some form.
Yeah.
Some form or fashion, we all have shackles, right? We always have to kind of define what freedom means to us. No matter who you are, in life in general, you have to find what freedom means to you. And a lot of times that takes a lot. It takes a stepping out of your comfort zone. It takes a lot of really finding out who you are. And that comes with, you might find the confidence and courage or, be empowered and never thought you had that. It's one of those things, but then also look at certain things and say, am I blinded to this idea or are my eyes wide open to this idea? So like we always say in history, it's cause and effect. It's yes and. Well, where do we find the middle and go, okay, I can see this and I can see that. I can look to my left and I can look to my right. And when I look in the middle, I can pinpoint what's wrong with this, what's wrong with that. But then what's right with that and what's right with this, right? I always say, like in storytelling, try to find the good in your villain. The hardest thing to do is try to find the good in the villain and then trying to find the bad in your good guy. Then you see, like a lot of the beautiful movies, exactly. How many times when you watch a movie is the villain created? Maybe happenstance. He stepped on a rock and jammed his foot and he's like, that's the last draw. I just got fired from my job and I was cool until I stepped on this rock. And then you're like, oh, wait, I understand why this guy is like that, or the good guy, you know? You always have that arc. There's a story arc. Well, I always tell anybody, try to find that story arc within yourself. You know, how does this play out in your life? If you were the director of your life, if you're writing the movie or the story about your life, how does it end up?
Yeah. No, I love that. The idea of like, you know, the individual, like going out and making your claim, like would, you know, go on your journey.
I mean, yeah, because think about it. There was people that fought in Harpers Ferry, and not to mention the townspeople that were fighting against them.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of people involved in Harpers Ferry. It's West Virginia now, but it was Virginia then. But fighting in this place a town called Harpers Ferry, a peninsula, right? There's a lot of people that were involved in it. I chose to write about an individual, but if we scale it back, I'll never forget. I was a kid, and I'm sitting in the back of the bus, like waiting to go to school. And I thought to myself, I might have been like 10 years old, and I'm looking at everybody sitting in front of me, and I go, I wonder how many people, and this is, so I was a kid thinking this.
Yeah.
How many people are gonna, you know, be alive in 25 years? Or how many people are gonna be rich in 25 years? And all this, and all these questions that can't be answered right there on the bus as I'm looking at all these kids.
Yeah.
You know, I'm 10 years old, so there's kids sitting in front of me. I still wonder to this day.
You know, I love that, Don. Like I've had two people on my podcast. One is a former student, Calvin Scott, who was at a BLM like rally and got like, you know, tear gas and stuff like that. And he was like part of that like thing, got beat up by the cops and the whole thing. He wasn't being violent, but he was like there for that. And then I had another person, Luke